Hi everyone and welcome to Safe Diving. So most of you have probably seen one of the first videos on my channel where I basically talk about my diving history, and it has some decent views. People seem interested, but it was a bit vague and unscripted. It was an early video, just me talking to a camera. So now that my channel is growing bigger and more divers are watching my advice videos, I thought that you guys might actually want to know a little bit more about who you're listening to. Because you've probably been watching me talk about scuba diving for years now on Simply Scuba's channel, and now you're watching my own channel, I thought that I'd spend a little bit more time just kind of breaking down my own timeline and how I basically got into scuba diving. So let's get into it. So I was born in the east of England in 1987, and I went to a very fine school called Homewood House, which had its own on-site swimming pool, so I was taught to swim at a very young age. Now, from what I remember, I wasn't the strongest of swimmers, but I was competent, and I just loved swimming, but I always preferred it when I had swimming goggles on, so that I could actually see underwater. Now, I grew up in the 90s, which makes me, Gen Y? And my first experience with snorkeling would probably be off the French coast on holiday somewhere in the 90s, using my dad's mask and fins. A Bochat mask and a pair of rubber fins that probably didn't fit me, but I don't think I would have cared at the time. Now, I don't remember being too enthralled or obsessed with snorkeling back then, but I do remember loving to swim and just being in the water, but mainly under the water. Both myself and my sister just loved to swim under the water, which my mother hated, obviously, but she actually had a bad experience when she was a child where she was under the water and a bunch of geese were splashing around all over and around her, so she never put her head under the water. And she deserves a lot of praise because she would always take me and my sister swimming, and that fear of putting her head under the water obviously never passed along to me or my sister. My first experience with scuba diving was around 2003 as an afternoon activity during the Army Cadets at school. My secondary school had its own swimming pool too, only it wasn't great, but it was sufficient for a try dive. From what I remember about it, I can't remember if we actually did any actual skills or not, but I do remember swimming around a bit before we did a great exercise where there was something like 8 of us in the pool, but only 3 scuba sets. No one was wearing them. So there were 6 second stages to breathe from, and they were all in different corners of the pool. So we'd have to constantly move between the tanks and buddy breathing to stay underwater. So we were doing some pretty interesting stuff, and we just kind of got on with it as a game. Not a great deal happened for a while after that, from what I remember, to do with scuba diving specifically. I mean, I do remember spending a lot of time snorkeling off the coast of the Dominican Republic, but I don't remember the gear that I was wearing. I mean, maybe it was my father's old Bochat mask that I found, but I don't really remember it. I think it may have been a cheap mask and snorkel set that we picked up somewhere. What I do remember is spending hours in the shallow reef just watching the marine life do its thing and what the fish would do to a brittle starfish if it got caught out in the open. But I do remember swimming down to something like 10 meters once and experiencing a squeeze for the first time and needing to equalize my ears and mask. But I did it through sheer determination to push my limits, and I remember seeing a group of scuba divers just kind of cruising past before I had to bolt back up to the surface for some fresh air. Now, I remember a group of American snorkelers sort of nearby, and they were asking how I dived so deep, but all of them had those inflatable life preservers around their necks, just kind of splish-splashing around on the surface, so they had no chance of diving down. After college, I went to university to study applied animal behaviour and training. You see, I loved the natural world and behavioural psychology. I passed my degree and entered the wonderful world of work in the late 2000s, which was a pretty rough time for a lot of people, especially those who had no experience looking for work. I even remember one position where I was looking at, and I could literally pay them to work for them. I didn't go for that position. But after a long time of looking for work and not really getting anywhere, I decided to volunteer abroad. I don't really remember what caused me to even look for it, but one day I just decided to sign up for a short stint doing marine conservation work. The position was a simple research assistant position in northern Madagascar, and I had to be a certain level of scuba diver. Now, I could either learn to dive whilst I was out there and waste a few days, or I had a couple of months beforehand to get there before heading out. So I went to my local dive store on Thursday, that was called Dive Line, and I signed up for a course that started that Saturday. So Friday was spent watching that corny Paddy DVD and going through the textbook. I passed the theory the next day, and the following Saturday I passed the pool work. That was the best thing about Dive Line. They had their own, and they still have their own indoor heated swimming pool that was 3 meters deep, and it was just for diving. So there was no rushing or skipping, and if we wanted to spend extra time practicing a skill, we had all the time in the world. But confined water just kind of blew past, and I don't really remember anything exciting that particularly stands out in particular. I remember feeling really confident, especially when it came to open water, which was at Gildenburg in Peterborough, England. So I set up my dive equipment and put on my waterproof Lynx wetsuit, which was a godsend because I didn't have to wear the rental Oceanic Shadow suit. And I remember 2 or 3 of the other students had to go back to the changing rooms because the zipper on the Shadow full suit was down the back, but for the over shorty you put over the top, the zip was up the front. So many students that I'd later learn as an instructor would put their suit on backwards with the zip up the front, knee pads on the back of their leg. But luckily I had my own wetsuit at that point. I went full steam ahead when it came to diving and invested in a lot of dive gear right from the beginning, spending pretty much an entire afternoon just picking out mast fins and snorkels, even a dive computer and a wetsuit with an instructor. It was an amazing experience just looking at all of the equipment and talking to an instructor, and it meant that my first experience was amazing. For those of you who haven't experienced Gildenburg, it's an old brick quarry in the east of England that they basically filled up with water, planes, trucks, a double-decker bus, and a whole bunch of wooden platforms linked together with rope so that you can navigate between them easily. Because Gildenburg isn't known for its crystal clear waters. Visibility is often less than 5 meters, especially when students are around, but for whatever reason, this never really bothered me. On my first ever open water dive, we were going to swim out to a buoy maybe 20 meters out on the surface, descend down the line so that we could equalize, swim around for a little bit, and then come back. The first thing that happened was my buddy, who was a large chap, let's be honest, he had breathing difficulties swimming out to the buoy. Turns out his BCD was a bit too tight, so he couldn't get a decent lungful. The dive masters and the instructor, they swapped out his BCD and everything was a-okay. We went for the dive and it felt like we swam for miles, but afterwards when I asked the dive master where we'd gone kind of on the surface, we'd barely done like a quarter of the way round. I only remember 2 things about my first dives. One was asking the instructor to check my tank because it felt like it had slipped through the cam band and like touching my butt, but it was fine. And the second was actually helping my buddy maintain buoyancy at one point by holding onto their hand. But afterwards I was qualified to go scuba diving, and my first dive was with some of the other students and one of the fathers who had been qualified for a long time, and we did a lap around the double-decker bus and came back. Nothing too exciting. A few weeks later, I would complete my advanced open water, and I don't really have any memories about my advanced, to be honest. I know that I completed the entire manual because I didn't know you only had to do 5 of the chapters. I remember doing dry suit orientation in the pool because diving in the UK, but that was truly boiling a bag because Dive Line's pool is set to around 30 degrees Celsius, which is lovely when you're in a rash vest, but in a dry suit, it's warm. But I don't remember which other specialities we did in open water, but that was equally uneventful. Soon after, I packed my bags with just way too much stuff and boarded a plane for Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar, via Johannesburg. That was the longest journey I'd ever done, and I was all by myself. I landed in Tana and got in a taxi to my hotel. Only the guy that helped me with my bags at the airport got in the other side of the car for the journey. Odd, I thought, and when they stopped down the road at a nearby lay-by, I kind of braced myself for a really bad experience, but the chap hopped out of the car, so I figured, hey, maybe it's just the end of his shift and the taxi's just dropping him off near his home. He then gets back in the taxi, which was very worrying, with the biggest wad of cash I've ever seen, and asks if I want to exchange any money. I decline, and he's all confused, asking how I'm going to pay for my hotel room. Turns out that credit card transactions were pretty new to the area, but we head to the hotel without any real problems. The next problem is trying to convey to the hotel in my best rudimentary French that my room was already paid for online. You see, mine was the very first online reservation they had ever received, and they didn't understand how the payment worked. It was all worked out with a four-way international conversation between myself, my parents in the UK, the online reservation company, and the hotel. But it was all settled, and I went up to my room, which was the grandest, most polished marble room I'd ever been in, and this wasn't an expensive hotel, but it had floor-to-ceiling windows along two of the walls, a panoramic vista of the city and the countryside. It was lovely. From what I could tell, I was the only guest there as well. I mean, I went down for dinner and I was the only person there, but I did leave very early in the morning. So early, in fact, that the bellboy had obviously been told to stay awake ready for me, because I actually woke him up sleeping on a sleeping bag on the floor of the lobby with a little portable TV. He jumped up and sorted everything out and drove me to the airport for my next flight. We flew north to Antananarivo with a quick stop at Maramba, I think. I met up with the crew that I'd be working with, and we head to a small hotel where I'm sharing a room with Alex, who would become a good friend. And we're sharing a double bed in an uncomfortably warm room. We've had the choice of basically an electric fan, which clicked every time it changed direction, or we could always open the bathroom door that would gently bang in the wind to keep us cool. Either way, the following day we have a good old-fashioned safety briefing warning us all about the potential nasty things that could kill us, and basically what could happen to us and what to avoid. We make our way to a small campsite north of the bay, and that's where the six of us would stay, monitoring aquatic life in the area. A small island over to our left was called Leper Island. It was an old leper colony. Wonderful. And the closest thing to civilization was a half-hour boat trip across the bay away. Alex wasn't actually qualified as a diver yet, so he spent the first few days learning to scuba dive, whilst the rest of us just kind of learnt to identify the local species and helped out around camp. That's when I would step on a rusty nail and learn the joys of dousing an open wound with iodine solution. I never had any ill effects from the wound, but man did that hurt, especially while scuba diving. My mentor at the time was Robbie, who's a keen nature photographer now, so check out his Instagram in the description down below. We would go out for shore dives, identifying fish for my accuracy, and just kind of learning how to run transit lines and record fish, whilst other team members focused on coral, inverts and algae, and good old substrate, just determining what type of sand it was. One of my freakiest underwater experiences was on one of these very early dives. I was diving with a guy called Finn off the shores of Leper Island. Didn't go on the island, but nearby. Just kind of looking at local sort of fish species when we spot this kind of black shape hovering in mid-water. It has no discernible fish shape to it, and neither is it moving. It's just hovering there ominously in the middle of the water column. We kind of swim closer to check it out, which doesn't really help, to be honest. It's only clearer and a bit closer, but this kind of black shape looks like it's kind of whale skin with the kind of the barnacles on it. So my first thought was maybe a whale was attacked and this is just a chunk of it, only when I swam right up close to it, it's just a plastic bag floating in mid-water. So we collect it and just head back. Marine conservation on a beach in Madagascar was all very well and good, but it was a volunteer position, so I couldn't do it forever. So I headed back home and eventually got a job at my local dive centre. And whilst they couldn't pay me very much, they basically put me through courses as payment. So I started helping out around the dive centre. They put me on an Apex Regulator servicing course and I completed my rescue diver course. Then another young guy would join me for my dive master. So his name was Alan and he was the son of an American military diver at the nearby American military base, and we were going to go through our dive master course together. And this was great experience. We were both on similar wavelengths and we put one another through our paces in the water, so we were both very confident in the water by the end. We spent all of our time in the water, and that was when things got a little bit weird at the company. I'd only been working there at the dive centre for maybe a couple of months, but the guy that was managing the dive centre, my boss as I saw it, was basically stealing from the company, and it turns out that he was a nasty piece of work. So the breakup was kind of less than amicable, shall we say. But after everything kind of settled down, I cracked on with my dive master course and started my life as a professional diver. But I will talk about that in next week's show, where I'm going to break down my dive master apprenticeship, my IDC, why I became an instructor, and if I have time, sort of what I did after I retired as an instructor, and now where I am today. Anyway, thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving.